Okay. Are we ready to go, Jeremy? You happy? Yep. Welcome everyone to the latest of the Shirley Williams series of lectures. Tonight's speaker is Jeremy Purvis, Lord Purvis of Tweed, who I first knew as a member of the Scottish Parliament and has gone on to be a leading figure, I think, in the House of Lords on international development, but also international affairs. And he's going to be talking this evening on the subject, the very topical subject of Ukraine. I just want to start off with a little story about Shirley Williams, because I think every one of these lectures should start off with a little story about Shirley Williams. She was determined to help in the campaign on independence in the referendum in 2014, and she came with me to Dunfermline and got latched on to some independence supporters, not just for 1 minute, 2 minutes, but 10 bloody minutes. Spending 10 minutes with any voter is outrageous, but with an independence supporter. But I would have none of it. I tried to move her on, to try and move and talk to people who might be persuadable. But she sat, and I've still got the picture, she stood in Dunfermline High Street and held the hands of this nationalist supporter and listened attentively to everything that she had to say, and shooed me off every single time I attempted to move her on. And that, to me, was Shirley Williams, determined to listen to everybody, no matter what their views, no matter what they thought. And that woman, I spoke to her afterwards, she was made up by the experience, and she was delighted that Shirley Williams spent so much time with her. So she knew what she was doing. She's a very wise woman, and I think the world is a poorer place without her. So anyway, I think every lecture should start off with a little story, and that's mine. So now we're going to try and, if you've got questions, put them in the chat function rather than in the Q&A, because it's quite difficult to navigate both. If you've got questions or even just comments, put them in the chat function, and we will read them out once Jeremy's finished this contribution. I want to just, before I forget, the next event in the Shirley Williams series is with Andrew Adonis. And Andrew Adonis will be speaking on the subjects of the politics of the Progressive Alliance. And he is going to be speaking in April. Let me just grab the date here. It's on Friday the 15th of April at 7 o'clock. And if you can go to the shirleywilliamslectures.org.uk website, you'll be able to sign up on there. So it's Andrew Adonis on Friday the 15th of April, and it's the politics of the Progressive Alliance, and it starts at 7 o'clock. Ben Stoneham is chairing that event for us. So anyway, that's our introductions. So get ready with your questions. Without further ado, over to you, Jeremy.
Thanks, Willie. I think you're supposed to advertise the more interesting speaker after I have finished, rather than make people think that they have to suffer me before they get the more interesting speaker. It reminded me when I was MSP, I attended an event where I was on it all day long, and I was due to be speaking after lunch, and the guy who was chairing it had forgot to give the health and safety announcement at the start. So just before I spoke, he said, before I ask Mr. Purvis to speak, if anybody needs to leave in an emergency, the exits are at the back of the hall. So it's not a very good preface, but Willie, thanks very much. Thank you to the Tom and the organisers, Mike Story and others, and the Shirley Williams lecture series. And it's a very timely area. And Willie, thanks very much for chairing this with your experience as MP, MSP, my former leader, and someone who put my name forward to be in the House of Lords. So I'm in your debt, and so are all my colleagues here. We are in a state of hybrid warfare. Elements of its declaration had been legislated for only last night with the economic crime bill and also other sanctions elements. There's more to come. We've got more sanctions next week, which I'll be speaking to in the Lords, and we will be having further elements. We have joined with our allies for the first such hybrid warfare with a major power in our lifetime. This is hybrid warfare. Our aim is to inflict significant economic damage to bring about a military objective to a nuclear power. So the seriousness is perfectly clear for everyone. And this evening I will share thoughts on how it has come about, the implications on what may happen next, and what long-term impact it will have on the world order. And I would be very happy to have discussions after my reflections through the Q&A. Before I begin, I wanted to have a preface. On Sunday past, I happened to be in London rather than in the borders, because I was coming back from a visit in Africa, and I spoke at a rally in Whitehall organised by London Euromaidan of thousands of Ukrainians opposed to the Russian illegal aggression. I offered the solidarity of my party, of Parliament, and the wider public to them. I told the people there who've got friends and loved ones in great danger back in Ukraine that my party, and which is President Zelensky's party's affiliate sister party, supported the aims and aspirations of those who wish to live in a free and democratic nation, and were appalled and disgusted by the gross human rights abuses as a result of that illegal aggression by President Putin's regime. There should be no impunity for the horror that he has inflicted on the Ukrainian people, and we must ensure that our support for Ukraine is irrefutable for the long term. And it is going to be for the long term. This is why I called for the UK to immediately establish, for example, a panel of expert investigators and jurists to support the ICC prosecutor, to make sure that those who are inflicting this are properly prosecuted and then held to account in the future. 6 years earlier, in 2014, I visited Euromaidan in Kyiv itself, and I was amongst the charred buildings and at the locations where there had been the protests and demonstrations against Russian interference to try and prevent the people of making their own decisions to represent their aspirations to be closer to the European Union. And many there had sacrificed their lives for this, sacrificed their lives to have the freedom to choose their own destiny in a democratic manner. And I had hoped then that the sacrifices they made would be the final deaths in this ambition. But thousands of women, children, young men and old are paying the price for seeking a democratic and free future. For some in our generation here at home who take liberty for granted, this is a lesson, in my view, that liberalism will perish from the earth without it being fought for. And Ukrainians are fighting for it with great bravery and resilience. So first, what has led to this bloodshed? Well, that year, 2014, and 1991 are 2 years, I think, of great significance. 23 years has separated those two critical years in Vladimir Putin's view of his country, its history, and what should be its future. His address to the people, you remember, before he gave this false narrative, some had said it was rambling, contradictory, and had elements of quack historian, but it was nevertheless revealing, in my view. From 1991, the years of humiliation and economic chaos in the 1990s, which followed the end of the Soviet Union, which he saw, where the West, he's considered, was a destabilizing factor, were formative for him, I believe. And then the years following the failure to permanently prevent Ukraine seeking greater Western alliances after the 2014 Euromaidan were even more so, because Putin, for him, Russia is not able to take its place in the community of nations without it being an imperial power, with a buffer of subjugation around it, without which its security is vulnerable, as has been shown in history. Imperial Russia, whether it's governed by a czar, a general secretary, or a president, needs to have a form of island, and those waters around it cannot be under the sphere of the West, who would seek to continue to reduce Russia's place in the world, militarily and economically. That's why the NATO members around the western arc of Russia and the European Union members around the arc were an existential threat for him, even though that they were democratic and based on some fundamental values. It was, even Russia was before the war, this war, an economy declining to be the size of Spain, and now it's collapsing even further. More on this later. But him and the Siloviki, or as we would say, the hard men, are the people around him now who were there in the early 2000s, who shared in this view. These are not the oligarchs whose power I sometimes feel is slightly exaggerated, but a core group of loyal lieutenants have been with them since he took power after the years of humiliation in the 1990s. One of them, Sergei Naryshkin, now Russia's foreign intelligence chief, which you may have seen, had his own humiliation when he was on the televised Security Council meeting, when he got the fictional narrative pretense for war out of chronological order, which annoyed Putin. The Siloviki either support Putin's sweep of aggrieved history or care little for it, but know the president provides them with the power and the wealth they need to maintain dignity as they see it, which is above the very oligarchs that we hear much. And this is the corruption which is within the apparatus, which is perfectly clear in my view to see. Kievan Rus, the mother of all Russian cities, is Kiev, as some Russians see it, the home of the language, the Orthodox Church, which now some of you may have seen on the news has apparently now blessed the Russian aggression, are all part of this denial of the people of Ukraine to be a sovereign state. As one Russian put it to me a few years ago, Russia without Kiev is like England without Runnymede. And he asked, how would I feel about that? And when I pointed out I was a borderer from Berwick and I was born in a town that's changed hands 13 times between England and Scotland, and I said it wouldn't bother me very much, and I didn't follow his argument. He didn't seem that impressed by that. But this is part of that sweep of history, as they see it in a corrupted way, plus the actual corruption of the apparatus of power, I think has led to this horror. Now, there's lively debate as to whether this invasion is also a very major miscalculation and planned terribly. And it could be as a result of the red flag narrative and corruption of the apparatus itself. So they feed into also the complacency about the prowess of what the Russian state is able to have. So is it a major miscalculation? Well, the images of this 60-kilometer long column of military vehicles looming upon Kiev is one of very major foreboding, but to some extent, it reminded me of the tales of the Potemkin villages with their facades built and rebuilt on the journey of Catherine the Great so that she could see the limitless expansion of the Russian Empire, with military vehicles using cheap Chinese tires, being driven by teenage conscripts who were not even told they were going to war, whose main task has been to try and source fuel. These are Potemkin facades, but with evil intent. The more the initial military strategy seemed to have failed, the more the brutal and indiscriminate weaponry seen in Chechnya and Syria will be deployed upon the civilians in Ukraine. And I think less bringing Ukraine back into Kiev and Rus, but more making it uninhabitable for so many people. The reports that the spare uniform the conscripted troops had with them in that column was not battle dress, but ceremonial dress for the victory march scheduled for last week. May well be true, but there's no doubt that this is the most grievously deadly military operation for Russia since the Second World War. And there's part of a tragic comment element which the Ukrainians have exploited brilliantly. It's a startling fact, but in 10 years of Russia in Afghanistan, they lost 15,000 deaths. In 10 days in Ukraine, they've lost 6,000. Putin is even more dangerous now, given supplies are not ceasing from the West to the Ukrainians with technical and intelligence support. And resistance is resilient, and indiscriminate bombardments are the tactic within Ukraine from Russia. And testing aggression beyond its borders may well become a more developed one. And we've seen this with the drone and the cruise missile strikes near the Polish border. And our response and others in the world will also need to adapt to changing Russian aggression tactics. Our party has been resolute. We've worked with others, but we've also made sure that we've added pressure on the government. And therefore, let's now turn to the UK response and then the implications that it has for the wider world. We as a party have been campaigning for years and months against Putin's apologists and the London laundromat and the kleptocracy that has been existing within London, just within the Lib Dem Lords, Lord Wallace of Saltaire, my colleagues Lord Fox, Baroness Kramer, supporting the work of our MPs in the Commons, have been highlighting the fact that London had been a centre for many of this hiding of the apologists for the regime. And just yesterday, we secured concessions in the Economic Crime Bill, and we've called on and we've succeeded in sanctions to go further than they would have been ordinarily. And we will continue to do this because the UK has been behind in so many areas, behind the EU and behind the US, right across the piece in this area. And we have been at the forefront of highlighting it. We've also been highlighting that the implications of the UK support will also punish others. It is welcome that the government has committed £220 million of development assistance to Ukraine, but they've not lifted their unlawful cap of 0.5% of international development assistance, cutting it from the 0.7 that we had put enshrined in legislation. So any increase for Ukrainian support will now crowd out support for other developing countries. And when we see that one of the consequences of this conflict has increased wheat prices and food prices, then those people who are heavily dependent on World Food Programme support in Yemen and other conflicted areas will be paying an additional price for this. The value of UK assistance to developing countries has gone down, and I do not believe that those people in those areas should be paying the price for Putin's illegal aggression. So what is the impact on the remainder of the world? Let me turn to this. I think there's an element of Putin having viewed a Chinese model of governance, which has been an autocracy, single party, wanting to have a state economy, which is effectively party controlled. And he's been attracted to this kind of a model. And with others who've been within Beijing or Dubai or Cairo or Moscow, have been at the forefront of presenting an alternative to the Western democratic model. But it's not just Western democratic model, but the democratic model. And we've seen through the recent effective coup in Tunisia, through the Sahel and Maghreb, right through to Kabul, a narrative and a lot of money, plus mercenary support, disinformation and misinformation, that has been challenging that whole sweep of two continents against a democratic model. And Moscow has been perfectly happy to allow its mercenary support to be involved in all the different conflict and working for destabilizing from the Balkans all the way through. And this has already been the case, but now it has been emboldened. But what has also been emboldened, which I don't think was part of Putin's plan, which was China has been strengthened by this. It may become a secondary victim of Putin's aggression if we see already that America has signaled very strongly that China will not be immune from secondary impacts if it is supporting directly the Russian aggression. But the UK and others need to show strength at this time. But the UK's leverage within China or elsewhere has been significantly weakened by this government. And I speak for the Party on International Trade as well as Foreign Affairs, and I've, for a number of months and last couple of years, warned against the fact that the UK has seen our trade with China over the last decade grow to now over £93 billion, but £60 billion of that is the UK importing goods, and we have a trade deficit with China of over £43 billion. This is the largest trade deficit in goods with any country, anywhere in the world, at any time in our history. So when Chinese officials hear Liz Truss say that we are now pivoting towards Asia Pacific to be an alternative to China, when we are now seeking to leverage UK diplomacy against China, that they simply pass a wry smile. And when Boris Johnson is now heading towards Riyadh, the leverage on Saudi Arabia is similarly weak. We are desperate for them to buy our aircraft and our weaponry, and we are desperate to buy their oil. At the same time, this government has allowed trade with our closest trading partners in Europe to decline by 15% since we left the European Union. So we now are seeing trade deficits with autocrats and declining trade with democracies. And the UK therefore needs a significant shift in how we are considering our external trade and our diplomacy. Because another one of the impacts with regards to this conflict is within the near area, within Turkey and Israel, but also within Africa, which is seeing the huge developmental challenges. But it's no surprise to me that as I mentioned, I just returned from Central Africa at the weekend. And the previous week before that, I was in Baghdad and then Beirut. Russia has been seeking mineral and gold rights across the whole of the area. They've been funding mercenaries, they've been funding those effective warlords to do it. And therefore, the option that for those countries within Africa and the Gulf now have a very significant challenge. Do they allow the China and Russian arc of this kind of operation, or are they seeing the direction towards the UK and with Europe? So let me turn now a bit closer to home in my final few minutes about some of the other impacts which may be more positive. Ed and my colleague Baroness Suttie are in Poland today, and they will have seen, as we have seen, unintended consequences, I think, of this aggression. Far from what Putin may have calculated, which was a weakened NATO and a divided Europe, we've seen the EU strengthened. There's been the biggest shift to German foreign policy in 2 weeks than there has been since Ostpolitics in the last 40 to 50 years. There's now a coherence in EU foreign and security policy. The UK, the Conservatives said, would never happen. There's a capacity for humanitarian assistance when we see over 2 million people potentially leaving and moving within the European Union area, but without major economic shock impacting on the euro currency. This is a soft power narrative for 2 million people who will be returning, hopefully, to Ukraine, which will be positive for generations to come. And we have seen a bolstering of President Macron, who had previously some within this country had ridiculed. And as I mentioned, NATO is stronger as an alliance, although there are very major tests ahead, and we shouldn't be complacent. Now we are going to be seeing the debates on UN reform, the aspects of what the rules-based international order means. In many respects, it is more clear than had been only a month ago. And there's an opportunity to raise the dial on eradicating global corruption, to focus on energy transition among democracies, and to make the case for democracy cool. some of the young people who are facing enormous challenges, the young women and young men in Ukraine, are showing the best advert in our lifetime for wanting to be democrats. And their resilience and their bravery is quite extraordinary. I'll leave and end on this point, and then if there's any comments, Willie, from yourself or from any of the participants, is that we shouldn't forget that there's also bravery within Russia. And what we do not know, and there is concern about what Putin will do when he is now seeing what could well be elements of either defeat or long-term quagmire that he has created. Many of us would have seen the picture of the TV journalist, Marina Ozvyakinova, who is now in court for having held a banner on TV raising concerns about the war. When I was in the protests and speaking at the rally on Sunday, it was a very moving experience for me after I was speaking to many of the Ukrainians, and when I was leaving it, walking back down Whitehall, because they closed down Whitehall for this rally, I overheard a police officer, an armed police officer in London, speaking to a lady who'd pulled over her car and she didn't know how to get up on her journey because Whitehall was closed. She said what the problem was, and he said that there is protesters. She asked what it was about, and he said it was over Ukraine. And she asked very innocently, not about the disruption or how furious she was with her car, but whether she would be able to join the protest. And the police officer said, be my guest. And he gave her directions, not only where the protest was, but where to park her car in the nearest way and how to walk back. And that symbolized in so many different ways the fact how lucky we are in many respects for being an open, free, democratic country. And my final words will be that also symbolizing, I think, a bigger choice that many people around the world will have. When the aggression happened and the UN General Assembly met, then one of the speakers was Martin Kimani, the Kenyan ambassador to the UN, and I've just with some colleagues met Raila Odinga, the former Prime Minister of Kenya, who's standing in for our sister party in the presidential elections in Kenya. Let me quote what Martin Kimani said in the UN. At independence, we had chosen to pursue states. Had we chosen to pursue states on the basis of ethnic, racial, or religious homogeneity, we would still be waging bloody wars these many decades later. Instead, we agreed that we would settle for the borders that we inherited, but we would still pursue continental political, economic, and legal integration. Rather than form nations that looked ever backward into history with a dangerous nostalgia, we chose to look forward to a greatness none of our many nations and peoples had ever known. That is a different narrative to that which Putin had presented as a case for war. And I hope that the UK will be playing a stronger role with our allies around the world that will be supporting that narrative for liberal democracy, rather than one that is causing so many horrors within Ukraine at the moment. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm very happy to hear views or to respond to comments or even those from Willie. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. I said at the beginning that you were a growing authority in international affairs and international development, and I think that proves I was right, that you certainly are. I think that was an impressive contribution, let alone the pronunciations of the various names. You must have been practicing that in the mirror for some time. It was very impressive historical look, but also trying to understand the Putin psyche and what it means for us now, as well as an analysis of the growing number of countries that may become involved in this. So we've got a couple of questions that have been posed already, Jeremy, and I've got a couple of my own as well. But let's start off with Tom, who says, when someone like Putin is so determined to not follow the rules At what point does the international law become a hindrance to peace and not a help? Do you want to have a crack at that?
When Tom, you're right. When you have a permanent member of the Security Council, which the president of the General Assembly, when the General Assembly was convened to reach that, said that the actions of Russia were wholly contradictory to the founding charter of the United Nations, that does raise very considerable questions about the viability of these institutions which Russia is a part of and will block. And we've seen, we called for the UK to follow our Canadian sister party's route to challenge Russia and the WTO, which President Biden has then subsequently followed. We called for, and the UK then followed Europe and USA on international financial institutions, stripping Russia of any of the preferential advantages that they have gained from the international order. And our challenge now is to use that order as a greater consensus as possible within the international community to ensure that this aggression is punished. And therefore, it is, I mentioned, it's for the long term, because what we can't have is what Putin will presumably now hope for, which was what he thought he secured in Chechnya and Syria, which is West fatigue on violence, so that the media and the public get bored of seeing horrors on their media, and therefore they will move on to other challenges. We cannot afford for that to happen. And we need to maintain this global coalition. This, of course, is harder if there are quasi-apologists who are also allies, and that's why I was mentioning China very strongly, but also within our friends and allies within the Gulf, and also within Commonwealth countries. We as a party are engaged in the debate about what reform of the global order may look like, and this is an opportunity to refresh that debate, so that those around the world who have been repulsed by this don't see it, the international rules-based order, as simply being determined by the West. There are many countries now, nearly a century after the system was established after the Second World War, that have very valid aims. And the UK, I believe, has a massive opportunity for convening role. That's why we called for a plan that immediately increases our development assistance, it increases our diplomatic presence around the world. We don't simply say we lead, but we lead on certain areas, like on the International Criminal Court and others, so that we can be at the forefront of trying to make sure that this order is robust. I hope that the aggression is so egregious that it will move us, but also let's not kid ourselves that Putin is wanting to take full advantage of being a nuclear power to try and prevent a lot of this activity by threats. But I hope that will not be able, that will not prevail.
I think your point, Jeremy, about Putin's gamble that we'll get bored or people will get bored will potentially be compounded by the fact that sanctions work both ways. And the impact on energy prices as well as access to some goods might start to hit people, and we might get, because I don't think people fully understand the level of the increase in fuel bills that is about to hit us, and that's before the impact of Ukraine and any restrictions on access to Russian oil and gas. So I think that's potentially going to have a significant impact. I mean, do you think the resolve in the UK and elsewhere will be able to withstand that? What's your thoughts?
I think the resolve in the USA will, because of the China dynamic, and I think the resolve in the EU will because of the Polish and the border area dynamic, and with the Baltic countries. And I also think within the NATO alliance, I think this is a point that Claire's reference I see in the chat room. I think the NATO alliance, I think they are stronger now because of this, and I think that resilience will be there. I also think that we've got to be careful with forecasting the future in such uncertain times. But I remember, Willie, when I was in Holyrood, when I was on the finance committee, we studied oil up to the Scottish referendum, and we debated oil a lot. A large part of oil price is reflected in traders concerned about volatility. It's not all about supply. And if you see the news just yesterday and today about the oil price now dipping, US crude now dipping, it's because America and Biden has provided stability to that market. And they are underpinning stability. And you think with this shock, what the impact on the dollar and the euro would have had, when you think of what those countries have done to the international trading market in gold, minerals, oil, a lot through the City of London, SWIFT, which is European, and trading in the dollar, it has not had a global shock. And I think Putin was banking that there would be a global shock. And therefore, I'm more optimistic that there would be the fact that there will be the sustainability of this.
Okay, let's move on to Daniel's question. He says, as Liberals, should we be seeking to lead the argument towards higher defence spending? And if so, should we be setting the agenda on what a larger British military capability would look like?
I don't want to cut across what Julie Smith or in the Lords, and then Jamie Stone in the Commons, and our colleagues on defence spokesman. So I'll call Canny a wee bit on this, but the debate is live as to is 2% of GDP for NATO enough, given what are now likely to be increased capability requirements within the eastern countries of the NATO alliance, as well as the wider capability that the whole alliance will need. There are some elements of which are highly cost effective, and one of the areas where I think if you agree with those analysts who are saying that this is a degree of miscalculation, is that what we thought was the prowess on cyber and high tech that Russia and China had, it doesn't seem to be the case that they are as strong as what we feared that they had been. And the Ukrainians have been able to manage high tech and also the other, and whereas the West's also been other elements of the hybrid capability, is proven to be effective so far to slow down. Now, whether that is ultimately effective or not, because Russia is now moving to tactics which they deployed in Chechnya and Syria to terrorize whole swathes of countries, to instill fear rather than having precision. But it's the precision and the smart use of capability which has so far proven so effective within Ukraine. And it is likely to continue to be, even if they are subjugated, because the playbook within Russia would have been that you take the cities and therefore the rest of the country falls under a puppet regime. That does seem to be unlikely to happen. So therefore, our extra capability that's needed is not necessarily going to be massively more expensive, but it's a live debate at the moment. Where we are at, where we've been for quite a while, is to make sure that the 3% ambition is perfectly clear, 2% on defense spending, 0.7 on GNI, on development, and 0.3% on diplomacy, which would mean a very large increase in the diplomacy also. Because as I mentioned earlier, one of the more effective tools will be the soft power and the diplomacy amongst the wider coalitions, especially amongst African and Near East, and also Asian powers who are seeing an increase within China. And let's not forget that China and others who are looking at this as a great opportunity, and there's an anxiety with Taiwan, and there could well be potential ripple effects. But I think that it's fair to say that we are having a live debate about that at the moment, about defence spending, yes.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. So, well, actually, you referred to Claire's question. The primary focus was about how do we communicate with the Russian people, and what means does NATO EU allies have to get across the narrative that is counter to what the Russians are hearing through Putin. I mean, what's your experience and thoughts about that?
Well, so colleagues like Alison Sutty and others, and I've got friends within Kiev, and also we've been hearing back from Russia. It is certainly the case that there will be very many people within Russia who are hearing the Kremlin. The closest, I read somewhere yesterday, the closest that people are hearing, that the journalists are able to say without being themselves persecuted, is describing it as a non-war, because they are not permitted, of course, to describe it as a war. Special operations is the euphemism, but the journalists are trying to get around about describing the non-war. So they're saying that there are potentially thousands of deaths of young Russians in the non-war. And there are many people who are trying to get around it, but a lot of the population will be hearing the view from the Kremlin. So us making sure that people have access through satellite technology and others, through the BBC and social media itself, who are able to be filtering, many people make up their own minds that they're not getting the disinformation that's provided from the cyber operations within Russia, is very important. I don't know what will necessarily happen to the Putin regime. I mentioned that I'm slightly skeptical about the impact of the oligarchs. I think a greater vulnerability for Putin will be that group around him, the hard men, as it's been translated, who all now are fearful for their future and the next generation and the next sphere down. So I think it's important that they will continue to get their view. Final thing I'd say of this is that it was very striking to me how one of the early targets was the broadcast, the radio broadcast column for the broadcasters in Kiev. And you'd have seen the picture of them targeting it. The fact that that is broadly irrelevant, it speaks to two things. One, the Russians still think that traditional media is the key. And the second is that the Ukrainians don't. So they have been absolute masters of the global media operation as far as messaging is concerned. And that has been proven to be a real threat to what Russia had seen. So that feeds into another element of the miscalculation and the fact that the Russian playbook has not developed very strongly. And it also, I think the part where there's potential vulnerability is the fact that that playbook, in addition to weak equipment, bad communication to their front lines, speaks to that corruption level within the whole operation, which may be one of the Achilles heels. It's too early in this operation to say, but the more that people in Russia hear the truth and can see some of the messages, and the Russian population seeing the young men on social media who were captured by the Ukrainians, who were given hot tea, and they were allowed to phone their moms, and they didn't even know that they were in a war situation, is very powerful. In addition to the fact that you really cannot hide 6,000 body bags, and you cannot hide that growing at an alarming rate. And you think of the impact that that had from Afghanistan. Putin will not be able to hide that, even though he will try. He tried with Kursk, if you remember, years ago, but he failed, and he will try again, and I suspect he will fail also.
One of the debates that I've found most challenging is the very powerful about the no-fly zone from the Ukrainians, and their argument, look, it's coming at some point to you, so just get in now, is their argument. And I mean, I find it really difficult to make the argument that we shouldn't be, because you see them getting bombed every night. We're in a no-win situation. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. But my hope is that there is an active discussion in kind of defence and foreign affairs circles about where that line is that is crossed before the no-fly zone comes in, because I hope there's an active debate, because there needs to be. And I mean, what's your thoughts on it? It's really a challenging one, but what's your thoughts about how far the Russians go before we actually...
What's your initial instincts? Were you a former defence spokesman before you leave?
I mean, my instincts are that we're doing the right thing just now, that we need to make sure that world opinion is with us about any step that we take, and so far we've kept the bulk of world opinion with us. It's clear that we are helping the Ukrainians with equipment, so it's not as if it's a completely hands-off situation. Obviously, we've got the sanctions, so it's not as if we're an independent force in this. My hope is that there is an active plan and discussion behind the scenes. Obviously, you don't share that with publicly, but my hope is that there is that discussion, so we know what the plan is when he goes further. Because I find it traumatizing to just sit there and see these cities and people getting bombed every day. But I know the consequences of taking the step of imposing a no-fly zone. I know the consequences of that. So we've got a duty to people in other parts of the world, which who Putin might attack next within the NATO alliance. So if we trigger it, it could be even worse. But I still find it tough just to watch it.
I share that. I've got sympathy with part of the argument that the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace said also about both the purpose and what the effectiveness would be in certain areas, when you think that, as I referred to before, the Russians are now reverting to the general bombardment and shelling from land. Unless you seek to take out that capability, you're not really having it. There are other potential benefits, of course, but I think where I stand at the moment is that I think the Biden administration, from my perspective, has been effective at avoiding the areas where Russia wants to provoke and bring in NATO and US activities beyond what they are at the moment. We have to be prepared for there being either accidental, misdirected bombs in Poland, or the cruise missiles that were fired to near the Polish border, I understand, were fired from aircraft within Russian territory. If Russians are now firing cruise missiles which go entirely over Ukraine and into a NATO country, then we are in potentially different scenarios. So this is I think, has to be monitored extremely closely. And the fact that we are at the moment able to be providing hundreds of millions of pounds worth of offensive capability through land corridors in the European Union. Imagine that, just months ago, what that would have been considered impossible, and it not to have been expanded into conflict so far, I think is an achievement. But you're absolutely right; it is hard to see the figures of those of the victims who are being shelled and bombed. The Americans will say clearly that the Russia does not have full air superiority, even though they are, I think it's 20-1 as far as the number of sorties, but they don't have absolute superiority. So there is also the live debate about giving extra capability to the Ukrainian Air Force, who again have been doing an incredible kind of operation. But it's difficult to rule out, but equally it's difficult to prescribe at this stage because of those concerns. I think, Willie, I share your view, and I think that as with other areas, the Russians will be very keen to try and find any way of provoking. Now, whether that we may well see, as we saw in Syria, phosphorus, certain chemicals, red flag operations, that there being munitions that land within a NATO country, which they will say is from a Ukrainian misfiring. Therefore, all of these things, remember how what the lengths they went to deny responsibility for the downing of passenger aircraft. We have to be alert to absolutely everything that will be coming, and a fair amount of that will be disinformation, wrong. Therefore, avoiding the expansion of this is a key objective, I think. But it is very, very tough, that one.
I've got one more question around, unless anybody else would like to chip in. I've got one more question around China. We've talked a bit about China already, and their, expansionist international economic development that they have been engaged in for some time is of a different sort. And I would imagine they feel uncomfortable with this style, although they've tended to not ask any questions when they're engaging in economic opportunities in other countries. But they're going to have to make a difficult choice about how far to go with this. Have you got any further thoughts about what will be the trigger points for them to pick a side in a bit more overt way? What's your thoughts on that?
They are there. You're right to raise this. I think they are treading a line. I think there's they're all with my international development hat on, and it was a live debate when I was in Central Africa last week. The China-Africa strategy and looking at their approach for strategic debt, as well as some of their other activities, and their mineral rights. There are some elements that's being played out in this Africa as well. So they are alive to the fact that there are very many countries around the world where Russia is now desperate for minerals and materials that are now sanctioned and prevented in embargo. China has that, and they have the rights to that. So China sees potentially economic leverage. But for other countries, I think there is serious questions that they will ask about their relationship, China and their relationship with the West on this. And they now increasingly are not seeing the Chinese infrastructure support or the lending support as zero sum. It is certainly the case that many countries will have found either UK or US or EU aid coming with hypocrisy attached, lecturing on certain standards while ignoring our own deficiencies. I think the UK, previous to this government, and DFID had a very good record for this, but nevertheless, it's still a lecturing, and maybe liberals do it as well. It's certainly the case. And they'll have in the past seen China as no questions asked. You have whatever you do, you don't need to reform, you don't need to be more open, LGBT, death penalty, we will never speak to that. But that forgiving nature, as far as that approach, they have a very unforgiving nature when it comes to that strategic debt. You will not enter into negotiations with the central CCP of China about debt relief, whereas you would be able to engage in different kind of discussions with the UK, the EU, US aid. There's a different set of discussions going on now than perhaps happened beforehand. And when it comes to the bigger coalitions, like there are certain countries that abstained in the UN, and other countries have already made a call, but this is yet to be played out. So China, I think, are having to play a very difficult game. I don't think China doesn't have an expansionist territorial aspect, but it certainly wants to be considered as it has always wanted everybody else to see it, as the central kingdom. It is whenever we talk about the Far East, it rankles from their century of humiliation from us. I think we have to be aware that we are dealing with two major nuclear powers, which they consider they've gone through periods of humiliation which are at our door. And we have created that, and therefore we have very little scope. And when I say we, they will single out the UK. And therefore we have to play a role working with either like-minded people or countries that we need to be as partners. This government, our government, has trashed many of those relationships, and that's to our detriment. And therefore it comes back to what leverage we would want to see about China, I think, and speak. But I think China is cautious at this. They've seen an opportunity that Russia is now going to be depleted, but they don't necessarily see that as what the Chinese would always like to see as a win-win. They're working this through at the moment. It may be that they are the broker for peace, but ultimately that's going to be between them and the USA in many respects, as far as this is playing out.
Brilliant. Brilliant. We're going to stop there. That was very good, Jeremy. Just before I say a final few words, just an advert for the next one. Friday the 15th of April, Andrew Adonis, who's not shy at being a critic of the party, and he's going to talk about the future of the Progressive Alliance. So that'll be very interesting to come along to. But Jeremy, that was an excellent contribution, very authoritative. I've stayed in wraps through the whole time. So, and I suppose I should be as the chair. You made it easy to listen, and I think you should be pleased just as much as we are proud of what contribution you've made, not just tonight, but to the party's international affairs policy. So, thank you, Jeremy. That was excellent. So anyway, we'll call a halt to there. Bang on 7 o'clock. How professional are we, Jeremy? Bang on 7 o'clock. Thank you for everybody for attending and for your questions, and I hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you, Willie.
Thank you.